Shalom Aleichem, ich heiße Bella Cooper Sanderson und es ist mein großes Covid und Vergnügen, euch zu begrüßen im Namen von dem Arbeiterring in Toronto und der Komitee für Jiddisch bei der Toronto Jiddische Föderation. Jahrelang arbeiten beide Organisationen Letoives der jiddischen Sprache und Kultur in Toronto. Der Fall sind wir sehr zufrieden, zu stützen dem jetzigen Programm von dem Nadal JCC wegen die jüdischen Schreiber von Kensington, von radikalen Poeten zu rabbinischen Lomdim. Ein Programm, das wird beleuchten für uns als sehr wichtigen Kapitel von der Toronto jüdischen Geschichte. Shalom Aleichem, my name is Bella Cooper Sanderson, and it is my great pleasure to bring you greetings on behalf of the Toronto Workmen's Circle, Arbeiterring, and the UJA Committee for Yiddish. Over the decades, these organizations have been very active in fostering and promoting Yiddish culture and language in Toronto. Therefore, we are delighted to co-sponsor the Miles Nadal JCC virtual program. From radical poets to rabbinical scholars, the Yiddish Voices of Kensington, which will bring to light a little-known but important chapter in Toronto's Jewish history.
Shalom Aleichem. Es ist ein großes Vergnügen, bei mir zu sein da, im Miles Nadal JCC und reden zu euch wegen die jüdische Schreiber von Kensington. Thank you, Lisa, and I also want to thank Cyril Troster of the Kensington Market Historical Society, who a couple of years ago invited me to speak to them about some topic having to do with Yiddish in Kensington Market. And I immediately accepted because I had been discovering over the years that there were Yiddish writers in Toronto and in the area around the Miles Nadal JCC and the Kensington Market. And my talk today is going to be about how I came to discover the rich and vibrant Yiddish-speaking cultural milieu that existed here in Toronto and is now mostly forgotten. So I'm going to share with you a visual presentation, and I hope that you will enjoy it. So from the 1910s to the 1960s, Montreal was Canada's largest city. So naturally, it had the largest Yiddish-speaking population in Canada and the greatest number of Yiddish writers. Famous writers like Rochel Korn and Chava Rosenfarb, Yud Segal, Melech Ravitch. So those of us who know about Yiddish and Yiddish literature in Canada usually think of Montreal as the center for Yiddish culture. But Toronto was also home to a vibrant Yiddish literary milieu, and this area around the Miles Nadal JCC, the Kensington area, with its concentration of factories, synagogues, and charitable organizations, cultural institutions, became its center. Now, this map is from Bill Gladstone's book, Only Yesterday. Now, you'll notice that the earliest Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe settled in what was called the Ward, which was between Yonge and University and Queen and College, as you see in this map. But in the 1910s, the Jews began moving from the Ward west of University Avenue to McCall and Beverly and Spadina. And this remained the Jewish area until the 1960s and even the 1970s, even after many Jews began moving north along Bathurst Street and into the suburbs. I can't emphasize strongly enough the invaluable contribution that Toronto journalist Bill Gladstone has made to the study of the history of the Jewish community in Toronto through his many years of journalistic work, his website, the various books he's published, which have highlighted the writings of Toronto historians such as Stephen Speisman, Ben Kafetz, and Shmuel Meir Shapiro, whose book you see here. And I'll have a little bit more to say about him later on, but if you're interested in Jewish history of Toronto, I highly recommend this book. However, when it comes to Yiddish culture and literature in Canada, the most comprehensive source is a book published in Montreal in 1979 entitled 100 Jahre Jiddische und Hebräische Literatur in Canada. The book is a lexicon, a biographical dictionary, compiled by Yiddish poet and lexicographer Chaim Leib Fuchs. His dates are 1896 to 1984. In this book, he documented the life and work of 429 authors who wrote and published their work in Yiddish and or Hebrew in Canada between 1877 and 1977. In the process, he documented the several hundred books and dozens of newspapers, literary journals, and other periodicals where their work was published. Read together, the biographies and bibliographies succeed in vivid detail, conveying all aspects of Canadian Yiddish literature and culture. They also reflect the development of the Yiddish language itself, historically and geographically, that culminated in the flowering of Yiddish literature in the first half of the 20th century. I can't emphasize or overstate the value of the work that was done by Chaim Leib Fuchs. To begin with, the lexicon makes clear the uniqueness of Yiddish literature in Canada. Today, compiling a lexicon such as this, would be impossible. In 1995, just 15 years after the lexicon was published, the Bronfman collection of Yiddish periodicals and other material at the Montreal Jewish Public Library, the main source for Fuchs's research, was dispersed among Jewish communities elsewhere in Canada. And can you guess why? Right, to make room for computers. Not only that, but Fuchs was working at a time when it was still possible to conduct interviews with living authors, as well as with people who had personal knowledge about deceased authors. That would be impossible today. However, for 25 years, that lexicon was available only in Yiddish. Then, in 2005, a French version appeared, translated by French-Canadian anthropologist and historian Pierre Anctil. I was involved in this project at the translation stage, and I read through the entire French manuscript before its publication, and that was how I first discovered the Yiddish writers of Toronto and the huge volume of work they produced, much of which has been consigned to oblivion along with the authors. What was of such interest to a French-Canadian historian was that the Yiddish-speaking immigrant Jewish population was in Quebec, where he was living, was literate at a time when many others were not. Jews were avid readers, and many were writers, and the Yiddish writing produced in Canada had a readership beyond the borders of Canada. It was read from Warsaw to Paris, from New York to Buenos Aires, from South Africa to Australia. So it's very ironic that I, the granddaughter of a Yiddish writer in Montreal, Israel Medrash, and the daughter of a devoted Yiddishist who eventually lived here in Toronto, Anne Medrash Glass, who was very active in Yiddish circles here, who was one of the founders of the Yiddish courses at the University of Toronto, its first instructor, that I would have learned about Yiddish culture, about this lexicon from a French-Canadian historian. So first of all, what is Yiddish? On the eve of World War II, Yiddish was the language spoken by the majority of the world's Jews. 12 million Yiddish speakers of the estimated 16.6 million Jews in the world in 1939. Yiddish originated about 1,000 years ago in the German lands referred to as the Rhineland, which you can see here. In Hebrew, this area was called Ashkenaz. The Jews began to settle along the Rhine River around the year 1000, and they have come to be known as Ashkenazi Jews. Hence, the Festival of Yiddish Culture held here in Toronto at Harbourfront every 2 years is called the Ashkenaz Festival. While Hebrew remained the language of prayer and study, of scholarly books, legal documents such as marriage contracts or wills, German quickly became the everyday language of the Jews who lived here. They used the Hebrew alphabet in which they were schooled to write the German in which they conducted their everyday lives. In the Middle Ages, the German lands were home to the second largest Jewish population in the world, next to Spain. However, the Jews of Ashkenaz were plagued by adversity. Massacres of the Jews there accompanied the First and Second Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries and peaked in the 14th century, precisely in 1348, at the time of the Black Death, for which the Jews were held responsible. And that's what this map that you see here is representing. So to escape persecution in Germany, the Jews fled to the neighboring country of Poland, bringing with them their religion and culture and their everyday language, which was Yiddish. Welcomed into Poland from the 12th century onward, the Jews of Ashkenaz were given their own system of self-government, and that allowed them to live an autonomous existence conducive to the perpetuation of their own language and traditions. Now, what you can see on this map is that in the 1500s, Poland united with Lithuania to become the largest kingdom in Europe, including what is now Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, and parts of the present-day Ukraine, as you can see here. And the Jews in all these places continued to speak Yiddish. But in 1648, the Ukrainian peasants and Cossacks revolted against the Polish aristocracy, and I'm sure that all of you here, excuse me, have heard about the Khmelnytsky massacres. The Ukrainian, excuse me, peasants and Cossacks attacked hundreds of towns and villages, murdering Polish landowners and Jews. And the situation in Poland continued to deteriorate until the end of the 18th century, when Poland was finally partitioned between Austria Prussia, and Russia. Russia acquired the largest part of Poland, which included Lithuania, Latvia, and parts of Ukraine, with a Jewish population of 1 million. For the first time, the Russian Empire, which you see here, had Jewish subjects, because I don't know if many of you realize this, but until that time, with rare exceptions, Jews had been kept out of the Russian Empire. So now, at the end of the 18th century, Russia, as it was simply called, which had managed to keep itself almost entirely free of Jews, now had the largest Jewish population in the world, practically all Yiddish speaking. So something had to be done to prevent the Jews from entering Russia proper. Catherine the Great, who was the empress at the time, sealed off the newly acquired territories by creating the Pale of Settlement, consisting of Russia's part of Poland, which included Warsaw and the 15 provinces east of Poland. And that's what you see here on this map. The shaded areas are the areas, and you'll probably recognize a lot of these names like Podolia, Vilna, Kovna, and so on. Before 1914, the Pale was home to about 80% of Eastern European Jewry. But from the outset, the Jews in the Pale were subjected to an ever-increasing number of legal disabilities, exclusionary laws, in addition to their constant confinement to the Pale. By 1900s, the opportunities for them to earn a living were so few that a large percentage of the Jewish population was dependent on Jewish welfare institutions. Overcrowding, poverty, unemployment, and government-sanctioned pogroms made their existence intolerable. For many, emigration was their only hope. So here you have a graph which was taken by a history of the Jews of Quebec. It's Pierre Antil created this graph. And in this map, you can see that the first 2 decades of the 20th century are known in Jewish history as the immigration era, because tens of thousands of Eastern European Jewish immigrants fleeing economic hardship and political oppression were admitted to the United States and Canada. Prior to World War I, immigration was virtually unrestricted. You didn't need a passport. All you needed was a relative in North America to send you a steamship ticket. And this immigration era, that which I just mentioned, before World War I, was the first great wave of Jewish immigration to Canada. And many of the immigrants in this group went to Montreal. So on this graph, the numbers of immigrants is on the left, and the years are along the bottom. So you can see that with the outbreak of World War I, followed by the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, immigration from Eastern Europe came to a halt and did not resume again until the beginning of the 1920s. The second migratory wave, which you see here, began in the 1920s. By then, many Jews found themselves in the Soviet Union, and travel was not simple for them. And as the economic situation in the newly created Republic of Poland continued to deteriorate, and in the face of increased anti-Semitic legislation and an upsurge in violent attacks, many Polish Jews tried desperately to get into the US and Canada, And a large number of the Polish Jews who arrived in Canada in this second wave were settled in Toronto. And Toronto's Jewish population increased significantly. However, as you probably know, Canada's policy on Jewish immigration in the 1920s became increasingly restrictive, and by 1930, Canada, for all intents and purposes, had shut its doors to Jews. None was too many. With rare exceptions, no Jews were allowed into Canada until after World War II. The last wave of Yiddish speakers to immigrate to Canada, and you'll see some peaks at the end, looks like the COVID graphs, Lahavdol, consisted mostly of Holocaust survivors. The murder of the 6 million Jews in World War II and the displacement of the survivors spelled the end of the Yiddish-speaking communities in Europe. And although the survivors injected new life into the Yiddish literary and cultural scene in Canada, with the loss of the majority of its readers, Yiddish culture could no longer function as it had in the past. So the biographies in the Fuchs lexicon reflect all the various historical developments that I've just mentioned. And here, these are also Pierre Antil's graphs. You can see the number of authors according to the period of immigration and the number of authors per year. The biographies in Fuchs also bring into sharp focus the various characteristics of Yiddish culture as it existed in Canada. Almost all the authors who settled in Canada had traversed countries, continents, and cultures. They had experienced war and dislocation. They had left families behind in the old country, most of whom they would never see again. Whom most would never see again. And most of all, the Yiddish-speaking immigration, the Eastern European immigrant population was literate, as I mentioned, at a time that many others were not. So here you have a graph of the ideological affiliations of the writers who came to Canada. So Yiddish writers who came to Toronto, like other Jewish immigrants, brought with them various ideologies from Europe. Jews in search of a solution to the deteriorating economic and social conditions in the Pale prior to World War I, and then in the newly independent Polish Republic created in its wake, were attracted to the modern secular ideologies popular at the time. Most popular were socialism and Zionism, in particular labor Zionism, which combined socialism and Zionism. The ideas of socialism, Zionism, and especially trade unionism would be brought to Toronto by the Yiddish-speaking immigrants and would shape the Jewish community of Toronto in the early years. It would translate into the founding of various institutions such as newspapers, trade unions, and secular Jewish schools. The Zionist and socialist organizations provided social, cultural, and educational opportunities for immigrants. In these organizations, writers were held in high regard. Yiddish writers from other cities in North America would be invited to Toronto to give lectures on a variety of subjects, recite their poetry, and distribute their books. Yiddish literature in Canada reflected the strong attachment that Canadian Jews from Eastern Europe felt to the villages, towns, or cities of their birth. Having left family members behind, often parents, They were constantly preoccupied with what was going on in the old country. Their strong identification with their hometown rather than their country of birth was due to the fact that during the 19th and 20th centuries, borders and governments frequently changed. Central to the lives of the Yiddish-speaking immigrants to North America were fraternal organizations called Landsmannschaften. The singular is Landsmannschaft, where Jewish immigrants could be with their Landsleit, their townsmen, people from the same town. And these Landsmannschaften were mostly in the Kensington area. Anshe Chmelnik on Huron Street, Anshe Ivansk on Darcy Street, Anshe Shidlov on Darcy Street, Anshe Apt on Beverly Street, Anshe Drilge on Markham and Ulster Streets, Anshe Celts on Dundas Street, Anshe Ostrovts on Elizabeth Street, and Anshe Slipia on Chestnut Street, and many others. I'm sure that for those of you who were born in Toronto or grew up here, those names or those towns are all familiar. These Landsmannschaften founded synagogues, such as the one that you see here, and helped newcomers to find employment and provided sick benefits, death benefits, and cemetery plots. In fact, the places that Jewish immigrants hailed from in the old country often determined where in Canada or the United States they would settle. In Toronto, a large percentage of Jewish immigrants wanting to be with their Landsleit were from an area in Poland known as Mala Polska or Lesser Poland, the provinces of Radom and Kelts. So the Landsmannschaften that I just mentioned were all places in this area. And in other towns, such as Szydłowce, Szydlowitz, Stashev, and Apt are probably familiar to you. So the synagogues of Kensington were named after Chmelnik, Ivansk, Szydlov, Apt, Drilge, Kelts, Lipia, and Ostrovce, and that's the one that you see here on this slide. Jewish cemeteries in Toronto to this day are organized around the native towns of the Jewish immigrants. And much of Canadian Yiddish writing was about the hometowns of the authors. So what is astounding about the writers in the Fuchs lexicon is the variety and scope of their subject matter. Yiddish books and periodicals had a large and literate readership with a hunger for knowledge in all fields, the arts, humanities, science, social sciences, and current events. In fact, many of the Yiddish authors in Canada as elsewhere were so prolific and their range of interests so diverse that they often used several pseudonyms. From the lexicon, we learn of the importance of translation for a readership with a keen interest in comparative culture, world literature, and modern ideologies. More books were translated into Yiddish in the first half of the 20th century than into any other language. Books by a variety of authors writing on a variety of subjects, from Freud to Marx to Darwin to Tolstoy to Nietzsche. This slide shows some examples. Now, you can see here the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and Arthur Schnitzler's Casanova, and so on. So translating was a common pursuit among the Yiddish writers, who were often multilingual. And one example is Akiva Broidis, a yeshiva graduate who immigrated to Toronto in 1922. He was a writer and translator for the anarchist Kropotkin Literary Society, for which he translated The History of Trade Unionism from English into Yiddish, by the History of Trade Unionism by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and a book entitled Romanticism in France in 2 large volumes. And speaking of anarchism, it was not in that table of ideological affiliations I just showed you, because the number of anarchists among the Yiddish writers was apparently negligible, but some of you may know that the famous anarchist Emma Goldman lived in Toronto 3 times in her life, mostly in the Kensington area, where she got involved in the affairs of the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking immigrant workers. One of the most important institutions in the Yiddish-speaking community was the Yiddish press. Whether they settled in North America or wherever they settled in North America, Jews founded Yiddish newspapers. The Yiddish papers were the primary source of reading material for the majority of Yiddish-speaking immigrants. Although there were others, the most important Yiddish paper published in Toronto was the Yiddischer Journal, or in English, the Daily Hebrew Journal. There, immigrants could find news from the old country, information about Canada, and news about Toronto. And the paper even acted as a mediator in the frequent labor disputes between Jewish workers and the manufacturers. And that was under when the Shmuel Meir Shapiro, who I mentioned before, was the editor. The lexicon makes clear, excuse me again, I'm sorry. The vital role that the Yiddish press had in fostering Canadian Yiddish literature. This is important. By publishing on a daily basis the work of Yiddish writers, journalistic articles, poems, essays, theaters, and book reviews, and most popular of all, the serialized novel. The Yiddischer Journal appears frequently in the Fuchs lexicon in the various bibliographies because many of the Yiddish writers in Canada published their work there, and not just those living in Toronto. Yiddish writing from abroad was also published here. Yiddish writers were the mainstay of the Yiddish press, and in turn, the papers provided them with an income and a place to publish their work. The writers were held in high regard in the Yiddish-speaking community, and the poets who were brought from Montreal and New York to give readings in the various cultural organizations were stars in the Yiddish-speaking milieu. Now, I wanted to show you an example of the beautiful books that were published here in Toronto. This book, entitled 100 Drops of Ink, 100 Tropfen Tint, was written by the founding editor of the Yidischer Journal, H. Hirsch, 1880 to 1931. And I think he was known in English as Henry Hirsch. It's a collection of original fables in verse published in Toronto in 1915. Hirsch himself was a remarkable man. He single-handedly ran the newspaper. He gathered all the news himself, composed the lead articles, proofread everything, and was responsible for circulation, advertising, and everything else that it took to produce and distribute paper. And he did all this while earning a living as a bookkeeper. Like so many writers in the Fuchs lexicon, Hirsch wrote on a variety of genres, on all kinds of subjects. In addition to his own poems and countless articles, he also published novels and translations from Hebrew religious texts. In the lexicon, there are a few names of Yiddish writers that you may be familiar with, such as J.B. Salzburg, a trade union leader and active member of the Communist Party of Canada from 1943 to 1955. He represented the riding of St. Andrew in the Ontario legislature. As a journalist, he also wrote in Yiddish and was well known among the Jewish workers in the Spadina Garment District. But the majority of writers, the Yiddish writers, like Hirsch and like Shmuel Meir Shapiro, who wrote about Hirsch, I'm sure you've never heard of. I wish I could tell you about more of them, but I'm going to highlight one journalist, one rabbinical scholar, and one poet. So the journalist that I'm going to talk about is Abraham Weinwein, who arrived in Canada in the first great migratory wave and became the editor-in-chief of the Yiddish Journal from 1915 until his death in 1932. He's best known for his histories of the Jews of Canada, which have been translated into English and remain an important source for historians. But that's not all. His biography perfectly exemplifies the uniqueness of Yiddish culture in Toronto as it existed from the 1910s to the 1950s. Born in Poland to an Orthodox Jewish family, in addition to a Jewish education, he was given a broad secular education. And why was it so important? To prepare him for the rabbinate. I want to stress here the importance of secular education among all these Yiddish writers, even those who became Orthodox rabbis and remained in the Orthodox world. While studying in the famous Slobodka Yeshiva in Kovno, which today is Kaunas, Weinwein joined the Zionist Socialist Labor Party. He was an active participant in the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, and as a result, he had to flee to England. From 1907 to the end of his life, he lived in Toronto. Here, he studied English literature at the U of T while becoming active in Jewish life, in particular as a member of the Polei Zion, the socialist Zionist organization. In 1910, he was co-founder and teacher in the first secular Yiddish language Jewish school in Toronto, the National Radical School. And that's what you see here. He was the founder and longtime chair of the Sholem Aleichem Library here, and he played a role in the creation of the first Canadian Jewish Congress. He was a delegate from the Toronto Polei Zion organization at its founding in Montreal in 1919. He wrote for publications in Europe and the US, and as editor-in-chief of Der Yiddish Journal, he wrote articles on a daily basis. In addition to reports on current events, he contributed essays on culture and Jewish education and book and theater reviews, as well as serialized novels and short stories. That really tells you a lot about him, but about the Yiddish paper also. In 1919, he published a work of fiction in Yiddish entitled In a Canadian City, all about Jewish life in Toronto. And I don't think that book has ever been translated. And that's something that I hope there's some young people here who are doing their doctorates in Yiddish or other research in Yiddish that you might be interested in translating, or at least investigating. In addition, he wrote several plays that were performed in the Yiddish theaters in Canada, the US, and abroad. And on top of all that, he translated novels from German and English into Yiddish for serialization in the Yiddish Journal, including the novel on this slide, and this is its German version with the German title Menschen in Abgrund by German author Jakob Fingermann. Now, Abraham Weinwein died in 1932 at the age of 44, which is just incredible to me, the amount that he had accomplished at such a young age. From the lexicon, we discovered that there were great rabbinical scholars in Toronto who were also prolific authors with worldwide reputations. For example, Rabbi Udal Rosenberg, the grandfather of Mordecai Richler, in addition to books on Judaism and his stories about the Golem of Prague, he wrote books on medicine, homeopathy, and much, much more. And he lived here in Toronto from 1913 to 1917 with his family, where he founded the Darcy Street Talmud Torah. And Mordecai Richler's mother wrote the book, The Errand Runner. She's the daughter of Rabbi Rosenberg, the youngest child. And she talks about their life in Toronto in that book. I have to say it was a life of great poverty and hardship. But I wanted to focus on one rabbi, and I've chosen Rabbi Yehuda Leib Graubart. His dates are 1862 to 1937, as you see here. Not only because of the significant role he played in the history of the Jewish community in Toronto, but also, and I'm sorry, I think it is 1967, but also because he was a gifted and prolific writer. For him, the quality of his writing and writing style were as important as his subject matter. He was part of the second great migratory wave. He arrived in Toronto in 1920. Rabbi Graubart hailed from an illustrious rabbinical family that recognized his genius when he was a little boy. As a rabbi, he served in various communities in Poland, most notably Staszic. During World War I, in 1915, he was sent deep into Russia by the Tsarist regime, along with other rabbis, as part of a group of Polish Jews who were sent as hostages. You call that as a kladnik in Yiddish, in case of espionage by the Jewish population in Poland. Returning to Poland, he wrote his Sefer Zikaron, much of it in Yiddish, about the 4 years of upheaval, revolutions, epidemics, economic crises, starvation and poverty, the horrific experiences of the Jewish population in the war years from 1914 to 18, and the painfully tragic situation of Russian Jews after the Bolshevik Revolution. The book was praised in the Yiddish press as an important source of Jewish historical research on the Jews in the early years under the Bolsheviks. And I don't think it's ever been translated into English. So this would really be of interest to any students of Yiddish history and so on. When Rabbi Graubart returned to Poland, you can see from this picture that he was one of the founders of the religious Zionist organization, the Mizrahi. And that was unusual because it wasn't the majority of rabbis who joined the religious Zionists. In 1920, he arrived in Toronto at the invitation of Toronto's Polish Jews to become the official chief rabbi of the Orthodox community of Toronto. He remained a Zionist and promoted the Zionist cause among the Orthodox Jews here in Toronto. In his writings, Rabbi Graubart cited both religious and secular books, and in several languages. He could recite entire passages, apparently, from Schiller and Goethe's Faust, which he read, according to Rabbi Nachman Shemin, at the age of 13. According to Rabbi Shemin, his writing on history, Talmud, and natural science testified to his enormous erudition. In his books, he revealed himself as a cultural historian, a philologist, and a scientist. He was a great stylist who would say, to serve God, you have to do it with beauty. And he would quote the verse, from Zion, beauty will shine forth. He continued publishing books in Toronto, which are well known throughout the Orthodox world. His most famous achievement remains his enormous 5-volume work, Chavalim B'Na'imim, Pangs of Delight, the Words of Yehuda, which I discovered is quoted to this day in Talmudic discussions on the internet. Now, I mentioned Rabbi Nachman Shemin just now, who was one of his students and very close to him. Rabbi Shemin became a well-known figure in post-war World War II Toronto the Jewish community. And I really wanted to talk about him also, but I don't think that I had enough time. He has written much about his beloved mentor, and his books in Yiddish about Judaic subjects also make reference to an array of secular sources, from literature to Freudian psychology to Marxist theory. They have yet to be translated. And there's much more to be discovered about Rabbi Graubart in the pages of the Yiddish Journal. So on the screen, I put an issue of the Yiddish Journal, which I happen to have at home, from 1973. Can you imagine the wealth of material to be found in this paper, which was published 6 days a week from 1911 until the 1970s? Thousands of pages about world news, local news, disputes in the community, labor unions, strikes, but also about Yiddish theater and books and authors. Also short stories, serialized novels, and poetry, much of it by writers, Yiddish writers living here in Toronto. And by the way, in American cities with much larger Jewish populations like Chicago, Cincinnati, Boston, Philadelphia, and Cleveland, dailies like the Der Yiddische Journal ceased publication in the 1940s. And finally, now I'm coming to the poet. Yudica was the pen name, as you see here, of Yehudi Szik. She was born in Garzhai, Lithuania, near the border with Germany in 1898. As a child, she was sent to live with her aunt in Prussia and then with a married brother in Frankfurt, where she began writing poetry and fiction in German. When World War I broke out, she was arrested and imprisoned as an enemy alien in a German labor camp under deplorable conditions. She was only 16 at the time. Upon her release in 1915, she found refuge in Sweden and later in various other places, including Finland, Moscow, and Kharkov in the Ukraine. All these experiences were subsequently depicted in her poetry. By 1917, when she was only 19 years old, she was already recognized throughout the Yiddish world as a poet of great talent and originality, thanks to the publication of her work in a number of literary anthologies and Yiddish periodicals. In 1929, she immigrated as a single mother to Canada. After a short time in Montreal, she settled in Toronto, where she worked for almost 30 years in the garment factories on Spadina to support herself and her young son. Here in Toronto, she published poetry, literary essays, and book reviews in Yiddish daily papers, as well as in literary journals devoted exclusively to Yiddish literature, published in Montreal, New York, and Toronto, and abroad. She also published collections of her poetry as books, which were praised by the greatest Yiddish poets and literary critics. Yiddish poets in North America at this time, almost all of them factory workers by day, were divided into two camps. There were the modernist poets who joined the groups Die Junge, the young ones, and the Insichisten, the introspectivists. They looked inward to examine and express their own feelings. And these modernist poets were interested in innovation and experimentation. But at the other end of the spectrum were the proletarian poets who believed that poetry must have a social purpose. In her youth, Judith's poems were more lyrical and personal, but being a devout believer in Marxism and the need for the workers of the world to unite, she became an important member of the proletarian school of Yiddish writers here in Toronto. So on the screen is her poem entitled Spadina in Yiddish, and in English translation by the late Adam Furstenberg, who was one of the first to write about the Yiddish writers in Canada. As you'll see, it starkly portrays her life as a single mother working all day in the factory while leaving her child abandoned and hungry in rooms rented from strangers. I will first read the English version, translated by the late Professor Adam Furstenberg. Thinly fragile is dawn's early air. Spadina, street of stores and factories, lies under a web of gray and dreams the dream of workers' good fortune. Individual steps on echoing sidewalks merge together with hundreds of others, a sound coming from laneways and streets, the sound from sweatshops of hands that are toiling. Spadina, street of the Labor Lyceum, with stairs and with chambers for people who labor, with their own judges, with laws that are just. Still, unity eludes the working masses. How many dreams lie buried in the walls of the massive bricked-in shops, of the young who gave up their schooling to seek fortune and future in work. Spadina, street of worker struggles, I add to those my own personal fate. My child whom I leave in grayness of daybreak, abandoned and hungry in rooms among strangers. My sorrow that wanders through ruins of worlds, through horrible sufferings of people still bleeding, to the clanging of wheels, of machines and of iron. You soak up my tears and my youth. Spadina, the street of stores and factories, of people who wait there longing for work. The day that will unite us all will be the golden key to freedom. And now I will read the Yiddish version. Zitterndig din ist die Luft von Frühmorgen. Spadina, du Gas von Stores und Fabriken, liegt in ergräuden Spinnwebsfahrzeugen und hollend der Hollen von Arbeiterblicken. Einzelne Tritt, wo's Hirten nach Boden, mischen mit hunderter Tritt sich zusammen. Ein Obklang, was kommt von Geslach und Gassen, ein Obklang von Schepper, von Händhorrerpaschne. Spadina, du Gas von einem Labor Lyceum, mit Trepp und mit Kammers von Menschen von Arbeit, mit eigenen Richter, mit gleichen Gesetzen, nur einigkeit fällt bei der Arbeitermassen. Wie viel Verleumdes es liegt begraben im Wind von die Größe gemäuert der Schöpfer, von Junge, was haben die Schule verlassen, der Masel und Zukunft gesucht bei der Arbeit. Spedeine, du Gast von Arbeiterkampfen, ich geb dir zu Steier mein eigenem Gläuel, mein Kind, wo sich los in die Gräue beginnens. Hungrig, heftiger, in Kammers bei Fremde, mein Saal, was blonket durch hohe Welten, durch grausame Leiden von Völker, was bluten, beklappend von Räder, Maschinen und Eisens, sappt in sich ein meine Tränen und Jugend. Spedeine die Gas von Stores und Fabriken, von Menschen, wo warten dort, denken noch Arbeit. Der Tag, was wird uns vereinigen alle, wird Ort der goldene Schlüssel. Wird sein Ort der goldene Schlüssel zu Freiheit. You can see how much more powerful it is in Yiddish. After that poem about the stark reality of life in Toronto's garment district, I would like to end my presentation today on a more humorous note, although continuing with the theme of renting room from strangers. I'm going to read an excerpt from a book by Montreal Yiddish writer, Israel Medrash, whom I've already mentioned, my maternal grandfather. This is a book, a chapter he entitled Borders, and the translation is mine. The border phenomenon had a profound impact on Jewish life, which was reflected in the press, in literature, and in the theater. The newspapers would print many short stories in which the protagonists were male or female borders. The same was true of many of the melodramas in the Yiddish theater. A typical plot went like this. A female boarder enters the happy Jewish home. She works as a finisher in a cloak shop or a baster in a tailor shop. Although she has a fiancé in the old country, she nevertheless falls in love with the husband and turns his head. He abandons his family and runs off with the boarder to another city. In another melodrama, the plot is reversed. A male boarder enters the family's happy home. He is handsome, elegant, smokes cigarettes. The wife falls in love with him, leaves her husband and children, including a sick baby, and runs away with the boarder to Canada. While a boarder running off with a wife or a husband was a common occurrence in the plays of the Yiddish theater, occasionally it happened in real life. And when it did, a search was begun at once for the missing husbands. Finding him was not a difficult task. The most popular Yiddish daily, the Forward, would run his picture in its gallery of missing husbands, a Galeria von verschwundenen Männern, which in those days was an important feature of the newspaper. The photographs in the gallery were closely scrutinized, and in the process, Jewish immigrants often recognized someone they had known in Eastern Europe. In most cases, they would recall that even in the old country, that person was a scoundrel, a swindler, and a cheat. Everyone who studied the gallery took a keen interest in identifying these people to ensure that they fell into the proper hands and received the punishment they deserved. In Toronto, this rogues gallery was studied assiduously because many of the missing people would hide here in Canada. Sometimes a husband who had deserted his family for another woman or some other reason was recognized. When the identification was made, there was a great deal of excitement. The person could be a factory worker, a small businessman, a salesman, or a clerk in a store. Immediate steps were taken to contact the alleged culprit. Sometimes it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity, where the man had no connection to the person whose picture appeared in the gallery of missing husbands. Occasionally, however, the identification was accurate, causing a sensation in the Jewish community. The news spread to all the sweatshops in the city. Everyone talked about the man who had been recognized from the gallery, how respectable and decent and honorable he appeared to all who had known him. No one would have suspected him of abandoning a wife and children for another woman. The man, of course, was quickly arrested and sent back to the city whence he had come. And just in case, now that's the end of my reading, but just in case you're curious to know whether you're related to any or descended from any of these people, I'll read you their names from left to right, because I know it's not easy to read on this slide. Mike Chernoff, William Kovner, Isaac Schwartz, Charles Greenberg, Morris Fisher, and Louis Nelson. And here I will end my slide presentation. And for those of you who may be inspired to unearth the literary treasures buried in the pages of old Yiddish books and periodicals published right here in Toronto, and to resurrect them through translation, you have the Fuchs lexicon that can be your guide. Thank you.